Great. Well, I'm Thomas Finlay. I'm a graduate civil engineer and young urbanist as well. And well, first of all, thank you for letting me to come and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts that I've been thinking about over the past few months. And like I said, it's fairly relaxed. If you have any questions midway through, if you want to, I won't get too offended if you challenge me on anything or call me out. And I want to introduce Doughnut economics, but before I start, I wanted to give a bit of context and talk about GDP and growth. And I don't want to dismiss growth completely. You know, we all want to grow, see our gardens grow, but the issue comes when we have this obsession with GDP targets and growth at all costs. So GDP measures spending, and you know, if you buy a new car and break it every year, GDP increases, but that might not be too great for the environment. So GDP doesn't really consider the impact in the environment, and it doesn't even really consider whether the expenditure is a good use of money. So like one of the best probably examples of the failure of GDP is like the Exxon oil spill in sort of the 80s, 90s in Canada, Alaska area, where the cost of the cleanup was so much that actually boosted the GDP slightly. So I think just the idea is that it doesn't really give you such a good reflection of well-being or the economy. But despite all of this, you know, it's widely used and quite a lot of things are dependent on it, such as investments and interest rates. And it's generally so popular because it's, you know, a single indicator and it's so widely used, measured by nearly every nation in the world. It's really easy to compare countries. And it's for that reason that it's so widely used and accepted that the Sustainable Development Goals are potentially quite interesting. So these are a set of UN targets and indicators that have been widely accepted. And an interesting idea is that could we potentially use this as a measure of progress, so measuring progress towards the SDGs, and use that as a better reflection of the well-being of an economy. And what's interesting is it, you know, it almost acts as like a definition of sustainability. You know, frequently we'll talk about, you know, resilience or sustainability, and we've got these different terms when essentially people are kind of talking about the same thing. So this provides a bit of consensus the same way that GDP does. And, you know, I guess one of the critiques of GDP is it's a single metric and it's easily to manipulate by politicians or used for any kind of agenda. And we can sort of critique this culture of economic growth and GDP for reducing these like complex outcomes to a single metric. So then the solution isn't necessarily to, you know, find this better single metric, but to just use more metrics. And these SDG targets potentially can be like a good framework for that. And, you know, we should be more relaxed and creative about the way we measure and talk about these complex issues. But then if you really like start to pick apart the SDGs and the targets behind these 17 goals, you start to notice a bit of a contradiction that, well, at least for me, it confuses a few things. So you've got this one target, SDG 8.1, that asks for 7% GDP growth per annum, but then, you know, within SDG 12, it's asking for more sustainable patterns of production and consumption, and you're sort of simultaneously asking for more and less at the same time. And it's a bit of a shame that, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals, which so many people are talking about, sort of missed an opportunity to abandon this idea of growth. But I guess you could say that, you know, hope's not all lost, because in target 17.19, it kind of recognizes this contradiction and, you know, asks us to develop measurements of progress that complement GDP. But you just, you know, you might have to wait till 2030 before we actually get something. And then that's where this idea from the economist Kate Raworth comes in, and what she's trying to do is to get us to abandon our obsession with growth. You know, and it doesn't really matter what kind of adjective you put in front of growth, whether it's sustainable growth, inclusive growth, responsible growth. She's trying to ask us, how do we create economies that thrive whether or not it grows? And it's this idea of thriving within these boundaries. And that's where her model for Doughnut economics comes in. And what she's done is, you know, it's combining these social and environmental aspects with like a local and global responsibility. So you've got these series of social foundations in the middle, which are informed by the Sustainable Development Goals. And the model says that we need to lift those most vulnerable so that they meet these basic foundations, while simultaneously making sure we're not overshooting and detrimenting the environment and exceeding this environmental ecological ceiling. And, you know, you want to live in that, you know, sweet spot of the donut, like sort of that middle section. And I think like one of the most interesting things about what's happening in the past few months with Amsterdam is that, you know, you had Kate Raworth's model, which was initially intended at like a global scale. And we're now seeing it being implemented at a city level, and it's interesting how it's kind of jumped the national level, and probably tells you a little bit something interesting about like devolution in the way cities or neighborhoods live and are managed. And what Amsterdam are now trying to do is I think, probably one of the first cities to implement this into a strategy, and they created like a circular economy strategy with this overarching question: how can our city become a home to thriving people in this thriving place while respecting the well-being of people and the health of the whole planet? And it's taken this question, and Kate Raworth's model, and it's broken it down into these kind of 4 questions or 4 lenses. So you've got a social local lens, for example, that would be asking how can we provide safe and affordable housing? And then an ecological local, which might ask how can we provide that housing without detrimenting things like water quality or local ecologically sensitive land. And then on the other side you've got the global, so social global, maybe how can we change the way we buy things to ensure that people around the world are getting a safe and fairly paid occupations. And then similarly an ecological global, so what are we doing at a local level that will influence the global environment? So that's getting us to think about carbon emissions or land take, for example, like how much land is the Netherlands using to sustain its residents. And what Amsterdam are now trying to do is they're trying to create strategies that would have the most benefit across both the social and environmental themes across the Doughnut. And they're sort of questioning whether these existing targets were holistic enough to provide and create these thriving places within these boundaries. So one example is Amsterdam's now focusing on what can they do to encourage short food chains and think about where and how we buy our food and what we do and how we manage our waste. This is a sentence I've copied from Amsterdam's strategy, and this is probably one of the hardest bits that I've tried to understand, and I guess I initially sort of ignored it. And they're saying it's not an assessment, so it's a tool and a starting point. It's ideal for using in workshops and opening up new insights to bring about transformative action. So I'm trying to sort of put that into sort of the Scottish built environment world, and I'm sort of seeing it as being similar to, or I guess used to complement things like the place standard. So it's not an assessment, but it's a tool for encouraging people to talk and encouraging public perception and helping us to identify any shortfalls and encouraging discussion and collaboration. And these 4 questions and lenses that they've proposed help to break down these systems and better understand different feedbacks and interconnected outcomes and impacts. But this point about it not being an assessment that I've been sort of trying to get my head around, because part of me disagrees and thinks this could be a great assessment. You've got GDP, and is this a way of now getting rid of that national assessment and replacing it with something a bit more holistic and more interesting? And this section here again is copied from the Amsterdam strategy, and this is probably maybe one of the more useful parts of the strategy, and it breaks down these the Doughnut strategy into these 8 sort of actions. And it's kind of like you've got the Doughnut, and it's like, well, so what? And how do we turn any of this into an actual action? So they've adopted Kate's model, and they're guiding people with these 4 questions, 4 lenses, and they're now asking others to engage and layer existing initiatives, ideas, develop your own understanding and insight, and layer them on top of the Doughnut. And it kind of acts as what they're calling a city selfie, and it's like a reflection of your own understanding of Amsterdam or your neighborhood. I'm not going to read them all out now, and we might go back to this later on, but the things I wanted to focus on initially were this map and monitor. So we're looking at existing initiatives and frameworks, and then identifying indicators and ways of monitoring our progress, or how we fit into the Doughnut and where the shortfalls and overshoots are. And I guess that's when I've wanted to look at the Scotland National Performance Framework, and I thought it would be interesting to see how the Doughnut aligns with the Scottish National Performance Framework. And this diagram shows how the indicators from the NPF are relevant to the social foundations of the Doughnut, and more specifically, this is like the social local lens. So what would it mean for people of Amsterdam to thrive? So people like Kate Raworth and Amsterdam, the circular economy, C40 cities, have made these set of attributes, and then they've decided this is what we need for a thriving city. And then the National Performance Framework is already collecting data on these indicators, And so this is just suggesting a way of measuring progress towards these attributes that Kate has said is important. And it's using data that we're already collecting. It's all the information that we have. And I quite like these, the National Performance Framework indicators are interesting because it's a mix of these statistical indicators, but then it's also got public perception indicators, and they're useful as ways for like validating each other's assessment. But I'm sort of, certain that these indicators aren't necessarily sufficient, and these are reported at a national level. But really, I think to get any kind of value, you want to report them at like a much more local level, so we don't geographically blur any kind of shortfalls in specific areas. And I've put, kind of like next steps of what I thought would be interesting to look at next, or I guess this is kind of the point where it'd be interesting to get other people's opinions. So first, I've suggested these are the indicators that we could use to measure progress on the social local lens. But I'm also asking, are there alternative complementary indicators, or even, aspirational indicators, not necessarily ones that where we've got existing data on, but if we could collect any data, what would we want to collect? And then also, like, I think it'd be really cool to find really sort of hyper local data, down to sort of like a street neighborhood level. And this is part of me where I think maybe GDP, if it was reported at that kind of local level, will be potentially more interesting and useful than it is at the moment. And the bit I've highlighted here, in bold, is trying to connect the social indicators to the ecological indicators, and that's a bit that is probably the more challenging side of things. So trying to understand how they link. I guess it's also thinking about, trying to boil it down to an individual action that, say, someone in the built environment or might have to make, and trying to understand how that single action, say if it was in the housing sector, is relevant to other indicators on the donuts. What is the influence of, increasing the housing supply in a certain area, and how does that affect the ecological indicators? So what the Amsterdam have done, they've broken the donut model into something like 4 separate questions, but really, the challenge comes when we're trying to connect them and find the impacts that these different indicators have on each other. And it's also worth noting this isn't actually looking now at performance here. This is just me saying these are the potential indicators available. So the next step would be to look at trying to map performance and then, predict trends and identify areas for improvement. And then also think, trying to identify actions and evaluate their impact. And that leads me on to thinking like, what is our role? What is infrastructure's role in helping keep us in this this donut ring? I might not dwell on this section too much, but this was just another thought I had. So I do a lot of flood damage assessments, which is where you look at the value that a flood scheme will bring. And the way it works is it's an economic damage assessment. So you calculate the damages that a neighborhood or an area might incur due to floods over, say, 100 years in sort of a business as usual case. And then you compare that to the damages or the economic damages that you might incur if you had a flood scheme built. And I just thought it might be an interesting way of bringing the donut economics, or the idea of Kate Raworth's donut, into that assessment. So rather than looking at the potential reduction in damages that a flood scheme might cause on, like, economic growth or the economy, but looking at what's the impact of flooding on this model of the donut, and how it influences both the social foundations, but also this environmental ceiling. So that's just another potential thing that I wanted to maybe look into in the future. I guess this now brings me on to questions and potential further research. This is maybe the point where it'd be interesting to see what other people are doing, and some of the questions that I've had when I've been looking at this. So one of them is, Amsterdam said this isn't an assessment, but then again I've just gone straight into it and tried to use it as an assessment for the whole of Scotland by using the National Performance Framework indicators. But then part of me also asks, like, does this actually change anything? Because in the built environment, we're already considering social foundations within these ecological boundaries. And yeah, it's a different way of maybe presenting it, but is this not what we're already doing? And part of me thinks, is this just like a marketing exercise? And are we trying to just realize these and communicate these benefits that we're already achieving? And I sort of don't mean that in a bad way, because I think, we might already be achieving these benefits, but communicating them might be a useful way of identifying additional funding, or maybe more creative ways of funding. So for example, if the donut lets us better break down these, this interconnected system, and better understand the impact of different sort of actions, is it going to help us understand whether, active travel funding could then be used to support a flood scheme? If the donut shows that the value of that flood scheme is providing benefit, these wider additional benefits. And I guess the final question is, I really trying to break this down. So I'm sort of operating quite like a local level. Very few of the decisions I make, in my day-to-day work influence things at a local, have much of an influence at a national or global level. So I'm just trying to think, like, specifically, how would this affect my role, and what kind of decisions that I make, how will they change as a result of this model? And I'm trying to think, say in a master plan or something, I want to try and understand is, like, when does providing enough housing turn into an ecological disruption? So, we're aware that we need more housing in Scotland, but when does provision of that mean we overshoot and go into this ecological ceiling? I think that's where I'll probably leave the presentation. Be interested to see what other people think, and also looking forward to a presentation later on this week that Rachel mentioned, which hopefully will talk about some of these things in more detail.